Block 6, the Great Depression, Section 5, after the 100 days, the section beginning with the court packing scheme. As we have seen, many of Roosevelt's New Deal policies were declared unconstitutional. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, was declared unconstitutional. The National Recovery Administration, the NRA, was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And the court starts to invite the anger of progressives in the United States. Now, if you remember, constitutionally, presidents appoint Supreme Court justices, and they are approved by the Senate, and then they serve until they die. So most of the justices on the Supreme Court by the mid-1930s are justices appointed by Presidents Harding, Presidents Coolidge, and President Hoover. They are, in other words, not particularly progressive judges. Now, some of them, there's one Roosevelt appointee, and there's a judge or two left over from Wilson's administration, but the majority on the court were conservatives, and they did not find constitutional sanction for all of the government intervention that the New Deal brought. They said that, look, as much as we might want to do something, we live in a constitutional republic, and the Constitution says that the government cannot do this, it cannot set prices, it cannot set wages, it cannot tell farmers not to farm. Whether legislature wants things like this to happen or not, they are not in line with the text and the meaning of the Constitution. They are not in line that all of this government spending and government power is not what the Founding Fathers had in mind when they wrote a government of limited powers. It is not what the Founders had in mind when they wrote the Constitution, and that these laws are unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court's word was sort of final, that sometimes the legislature could work around them, but in the end, the Supreme Court was holding up progressive New Deal legislation. Roosevelt was a master politician, but this is one time where he almost fatally blundered. He made a colossal screw-up. You can see by this cartoon, this is a picture of what's known as the 9 old men on the Supreme Court, that the justices' age was often used against them, that many of the members of the Supreme Court were over 70 years old. Some people said that they were starting to go senile, that they were only staying on the court to thwart Roosevelt, that if a non-progressive had been in power, they would have retired long ago. They were only sticking around in order to be perfectly frank, screw over President Roosevelt and his progressive New Deal. So Roosevelt comes up with a solution, and it's a solution that flies back in his face like nothing else he ever does as president. He gets more blowback, negative blowback for this than anything else he does. What Roosevelt wants to do, now if you read the text of the Constitution, there is no set number of justices. That there are 9 now, but there have been 7 in the past, there have been 8 in the past. That 9 is just a number set by the Congress. What Roosevelt wanted to do was add a justice for every justice over the age of 70. So for every justice who was 70 years old, Roosevelt, or whoever the president was, and at that time it was Roosevelt, of course, for every justice over 70, the president would get to pick a new one, and they would sit on the court together. Well, there was 5 or 6 justices over 70 years old. So if this became law, Roosevelt, one fell swoop, would have appointed 5 or 6 new Supreme Court justices. This hits the paper, and the country really explodes in righteous indignation. Even many supporters of Roosevelt were against this. They said this is the move of a dictator, this is something that Mussolini would do in Italy, or Hitler would do in Germany. That the Founding Fathers, who people revered, and the Constitution, which people revered, set up a separation of powers for a reason. And they set up a separation of powers so that a president cannot just go and make the Supreme Court a creature of his own political party. The sense was that Roosevelt was trying to make puppets. And you see from this cartoon, here's Uncle Sam, he's shocked, there's President Roosevelt, and he's controlling on his knee, like a ventriloquist, 5 Supreme Court justices who are just parroting his line, yes, yes, we all vote yes. Roosevelt's counter-argument was, he won the election of 1932, Democrats won the midterms of 1934, he got swept back into office in 1936. The Supreme Court is behind the times. The Supreme Court is not listening to the American people. The American people clearly want the New Deal. They want all the aspects of the New Deal. They have elected a Congress that passed the New Deal. They have elected a president who supports the New Deal. And they are stuck with this retrograde Supreme Court that is against the New Deal. But the American people value, in 1937 at least, they value the Constitution greater than they value political advantage of the moment. And after Roosevelt's argument does not gain much traction, he backs off and he leaves the Supreme Court alone. This kind of was the end of a lot of New Deal legislation. Then Roosevelt kind of slunk back into the White House defeated on something for the first time in his presidency. Now, and it seriously hurt him. It hurt him among Southern Democrats, it hurt him among conservative Democrats, it hurt him amongst moderate Republicans, and Roosevelt kind of retreated back to the White House to lick his wounds. And then the Supreme Court started to change a little bit. One of the conservative justices, Owen Roberts, who started off the New Deal voting against and arguing against many of Roosevelt's policies, either saw the writing on the wall, didn't want to lose the next fight, or genuinely had a change of heart. Nobody really knows. But Justice Roberts, in time, began supporting Roosevelt's New Deal plans. Justice Roberts' switch, plus the fact that some of these old justices just died, and Roosevelt got to name successors, the Supreme Court became much more progressive and much more liberal as the 1930s and 1940s wore on. In the end, Roosevelt is elected 4 times and serves 12 years as president. He replaced, with one exception, the entire Supreme Court. Of the 9 justices, he replaced 8 of them, one of them twice. Only one justice from the beginning of his term was still there at the end of his term. So if Roosevelt had just waited, he wouldn't have suffered this negative political fallout from his attempt to pack the court. But the court packing scheme, as it's called, Roosevelt's attempt to bypass checks and balances, really did not succeed for him at all, and it painted him in a very negative light. If he had done this before the 1936 election, that election would have been much, much closer. But he was smart and he waited. But it's kind of, again, that imperial presidency, and a lot of people looking at the dictators in Europe saw dictatorship in this move by Roosevelt.